Writing wasn't invented to tell stories. The first written words ever recorded were beer receipts. Not hymns, not myths, not royal proclamations. Barley. Beer. Rations for temple workers. That's it. That's how civilization's most transformative technology began. Not with a poet searching for immortality, with an accountant who needed to track inventory. Welcome to Know History. And this is what the evidence actually shows us about the birth of writing. I grew up with a particular image of ancient writing. Scribes bent over papyrus, recording the words of gods. Poets scratching epics into stone. Priests preserving sacred knowledge for eternity. It's a compelling image, and it's not entirely wrong. Writing did eventually do all of those things, but it's backwards. The romantic version of writing's origins, the idea that humans first reached for a stylus to capture something beautiful or sacred, feels true because it flatters us. It says, we invented writing because we had something worth saying. The evidence says something different, something more interesting, actually. Writing was invented because someone needed to remember who owed what to whom. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. And when you follow it back to its source, you end up in a city that no longer exists, in a desert that was once a floodplain, reading a tablet that looks less like literature and more like a spreadsheet. The city was called Uruk, modern-day Waqqa in southern Iraq. Around 5,000 years ago, it was one of the largest cities on Earth, perhaps the largest. 50,000 people living in close proximity, dependent on organized agriculture, coordinated labor, and a temple administration that controlled the distribution of resources. When you have that many people, you have a management problem. How much grain came in? How much went out? Which workers received their rations? Which debts were settled? Human memory, even very good human memory, has limits. Before writing, Mesopotamian administrators used clay tokens, small geometric shapes representing specific quantities of specific goods. A cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a cylinder for an animal. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes, hollow balls called bullae, sealed with the marks of the parties involved. And here's where it gets interesting. At some point, administrators realized, if you're going to press the token's shape into the outside of the envelope to record what's inside, you don't actually need the tokens anymore. The marks on the outside were the record. That's proto-cuneiform, emerging in Uruk around 3400 to 3200 BCE, the earliest confirmed writing system on Earth. And what did the earliest tablets record? Barley rations, beer allocations, lists of workers, records of livestock. The scholars who first deciphered these tablets in the 20th century were, reportedly, a little deflated. They had expected creation myths, religious hymns, royal histories. They got the ancient equivalent of a payroll spreadsheet. But think about what that actually means. The technology that would eventually carry the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, the Iliad, it was born in a temple storeroom, solving a logistics problem. Writing didn't begin as a gift to the human spirit. It began as a tool for managing grain. Now, before proto-cuneiform, there are artifacts that complicate the timeline further and are worth pausing on. In China's Henan province, archaeologists uncovered incised shells and bones from Jiahu, dating to around 8500 to 6600 BCE. The marks are deliberate. Parallel lines, cross-hatching, geometric notations pressed into bone and shell with clear intention. But whether they represent proto-writing or symbolic notation is genuinely debated among specialists. They don't connect linguistically to any later script. What they do show is that humans were making intentional marks on durable surfaces for thousands of years before the first confirmed writing system appeared at Uruk. The impulse was ancient. The technology took longer to crystallize. Now, if that were the whole story, it would already be enough to revise everything most people think they know about writing. But there's a second myth to address, and it's just as persistent. The assumption is that writing was invented once, in Mesopotamia, and then spread outward, carried by traders and conquerors, until the whole world had it. That's a tidy story. It's also almost certainly wrong. Egyptian hieroglyphics emerge around 3200 BCE, within a century or two of proto-cuneiform. Scholars debate whether Egypt developed the system independently or was inspired by knowledge of Mesopotamian writing, though the two systems share no symbols or structure. What's clear is that Egypt's own script is entirely distinct. It borrowed at most the idea that marks on a surface could carry meaning, and built something wholly its own from there. What's not debated is what happened in China. By 1200 BCE, the Shang dynasty used oracle bones, turtle shells and cattle shoulder blades for divination, applying heat to crack them and reading the fracture patterns as divine answers. They also carved written records of these divination questions and outcomes onto the bones themselves. The writing system preserved on those bones is recognizably ancestral to modern Chinese characters, a direct, unbroken lineage stretching 3,000 years. And it developed in geographic and cultural isolation from anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Then there's Mesoamerica, the Olmec and later the Maya, developing complex writing systems entirely independently, separated from the Old World by an ocean. Writing wasn't one invention that spread. It was a solution that humanity kept discovering separately whenever the organizational pressure became urgent enough. And the pressure, in almost every case, was the same one those Uruk accountants were solving. How do you manage more complexity than human memory can hold? Notice what that means for the myth. If writing had spread from a single brilliant inventor in Mesopotamia, we might celebrate that inventor. But it didn't spread. It emerged, again and again. Which means the invention wasn't the genius of one person or one culture. It was the inevitable response of any society that grew large enough to outpace human memory. But there's one writing system in this story that breaks the pattern. The Indus Valley civilization flourished from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, with some settlements persisting into the subsequent late Harappan period. At its peak, it may have been the most extensive civilization on Earth by geographic spread, with cities that show sophisticated urban planning, grid streets, standardized weights and measures, and advanced drainage systems comparable to those in contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt. And it had writing. More than 400 distinct signs, found on thousands of seals, tablets, and pottery fragments distributed across the entire civilization, from the coast of Gujarat to the foothills of the Himalayas. We've been studying it for over a century. We cannot read a single word of it. This isn't for lack of trying. Scholars have applied computational analysis, statistical modeling, and every comparative linguistic tool available. The sign sequences show clear patterns. They're not random. The script has internal structure. It was used consistently across a civilization spanning 1 million square kilometers. The problem is that we have no bilingual key, no Rosetta Stone equivalent, and we don't know what language or languages the script represents. The Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics because it recorded the same royal decree in 3 languages. For the Indus script, we have no such anchor. We don't even know with certainty whether it's a full writing system or an elaborate notation system for trade and identity, a distinction that matters enormously, and that debate is still active among specialists today. The Indus Valley civilization collapsed around 1900 BCE. And whatever knowledge its scribes carried, whatever those 400 signs encoded, disappeared with them. 400 symbols. An entire civilization's worth of records, trade agreements, administrative tallies, possibly religious texts, possibly literature. Gone. This is the hardest version of the story to sit with. Not that writing was invented for humble bureaucratic reasons, but that one entire branch of humanity's earliest written record may be permanently beyond our reach. We have the marks. We have thousands of them. We just can't hear what they're saying. We may never know what it says. So let's put this together. Writing emerged independently at least 3 times and possibly 4 in civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. In almost every case where we can read the earliest records, they're administrative. Rations, debts, inventories, questions posed to oracles about whether this year's harvest would feed the city. Not poetry, not myth, not the elevated record of human aspiration. Writing was invented to solve a management problem. And here's why that's more interesting than the myth. Every system of law, every preserved religious text, every scientific treatise, every poem that survived from the ancient world, all of it depended on the infrastructure that those Uruk accountants built. The Epic of Gilgamesh exists because someone, centuries earlier, needed to track barley. The technology that carried humanity's greatest stories was forged in a storeroom. That's not a disappointing origin. That's a profound one. Because it means writing wasn't a gift from the gods or a sudden leap of creative genius. It was a practical solution to a practical problem, invented and reinvented by ordinary people managing complex societies. And every single time, it started with the same question. How do we keep track of what we have? The answer, in each case, was the same. Make a mark, keep a record, build from there. The birth of writing as a bureaucratic solution, not an artistic breakthrough, reminds us that the technologies we mythologize as noble were usually born from necessity. The spreadsheet came before the poem. The ledger came before the law. And that mundane sequence is a more honest account of how civilization actually scales up than any story about divine inspiration. But if writing was invented independently at least 4 separate times, each time for almost identical reasons, to manage complexity, to extend memory, to coordinate large groups of people, what does that tell us about what humans actually prioritize when civilization scales up? We dig into history not to celebrate myths, but to uncover what the evidence actually shows us, even when it's mundane, even when the earliest confirmed writing at Walker turns out to be a ration count, not a prayer. What surprises you more? That the first writers were accountants tracking barley and beer at Walker, or that every early civilization we've found reached for the same solution independently? Stay skeptical of the stories history tells you it wanted to tell. See you in the next archive.